Well, it's good to see you again this week. We had a great week last weekend with Brian Zuniga telling us about God's great story from Genesis all the way through the book of Revelation and how God's written each one of us into that. I hope you've taken some time personally and in your small groups to think about the question, how do I fit into this story? What is the role God has for me to play? Not just people who go overseas, but in the lives that we live right here, wherever here happens to be for you. Well, this last weekend, we had another very unusual guest with us, Jeremy Courtney, who came to us here representing the Preemptive Love Coalition, an organization that's dedicated to getting cardiac surgeries for children. In fact, life-saving surgeries. Kids who have been in line waiting for it for years, but who are not able to get it. Jeremy and his team have worked to try to break through that logjam and to see these kids ministered to in very practical, tangible ways, and by extension, their families. He sort of illustrates for us some of the creative thinking, some of the risk-taking kind of thinking and action that's needed today to see the gospel of Jesus Christ lived out in very practical, tangible ways in the world that surrounds us. Now, as you know, we've been focusing on unreached people groups. And an unreached people group, by definition, is a group that has not yet been reached with the gospel. They have essentially no access to it. And as you would expect, there are reasons for that. And we've learned some of those reasons over the last couple of weeks. They live in difficult places. There are places full of conflict and civil unrest, perhaps totalitarian regimes that grant very few civil liberties to anybody. They live in perhaps inhospitable climates. There's no good, clean drinking water. There's all kinds of reasons why. But these people live in places that are tough to get access to. They're tough to stay there. And so here's what I was wondering and thinking about as I was thinking about you and your small groups this week. If you sit and think and talk in your groups about the world that you live in, who are some of the people that to you right now seem to be some of the least accessible with the gospel? People that you might think, oh, they would never want to hear. We could never get close to them. They would not be interested. They're just sort of off the radar screen for you. Think about that for a little bit. Who are the people that for you, and perhaps your whole small group, if you were to talk about it, would seem to be inaccessible to you? And by extension then, what kind of creative thinking would you have to go through? What possible ideas could you have for gaining access, for having presence with, for developing relationships with people that may seem as far away and as inaccessible as Iraqis in a war-torn country like Iraq? So there's one thing for you to think about. Second thing I'd like to encourage you to talk about some has to do more specifically with some of the challenges that Jeremy and his team have stepped right into the middle of. And that has to do with this idea of unresolved conflict. In this case, in Iraq, it's been open, full-blown shooting war that's gone on there for decades now. Not only when the United States was involved in military action in Iraq, but there was a previous war between Iran and Iraq. It's been an area of the world that's seen conflict for so many years now, that in that situation you have so many people carrying around hatred, carrying around wounds, carrying resentment, a huge need for reconciliation. And what seems to trigger that, and Jeremy and his team's theory is that the way that God does that through his people is he takes people who preemptively step into those worlds and show love. Love toward enemies who have not yet acted back toward us necessarily in loving ways. That the gospel calls us to do that. Well, so here's what I want you to think about. What about in your world? What about the people that you know, either in your own personal life or in our community, in our county? Maybe they come across a different line politically or socioeconomically or in some way. Who are the people that, boy, you just feel really uncomfortable around? The people that you would not necessarily gravitate toward, or who conversely you think wouldn't want to have anything to do with you. In other words, who are some of the least likely people that you might be used by God to step across a line, to fill a void in between, and to preemptively love in some way? What would that look like in your neighborhood, in your community, in your school, in your office where you work? Perhaps it's inside your own family. Think about that a little bit. Talk about it with your group. Because not only is this something that I think Jeremy and his team are wrestling with in Iraq and how to live that out for the sake of the gospel, it's also something God wants us to wrestle with as well here in San Diego County. Well, I'm sure that if you have some discussion about that and ask God to guide you, you'll come up with some pretty amazing ideas. So I'd encourage you to do that this week.